Thank you all for attending. This is an exciting opportunity to have a really frank discussion. My name is David Arnott. I'm the Chief Commissioner at the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, and I'd like you to join me in acknowledging that we are here today on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. I want to start by letting you know that we're filming tonight's discussion, and we're doing that in order to create an educational resource for schools in Saskatchewan and perhaps elsewhere. If you're interested, the video will be available to the public on Facebook at our page at the Human Rights Commission and also on our Commission website. So feel free to take photographs and post to social media during the course of this evening. The hashtag for the event, as you can see, is Stop Hate Speech. This evening we'll be closing at 9 o'clock. We have 4 panelists and 2 responders, and we'll be doing question and answer after the responders have spoken. And I want those that come to the microphones for questions, please identify yourself, and please know that we are taping you and we will use your question. So I'm telling you that in advance because if you ask a question, you're deemed to give consent to the use of that question and the video of you. So if you don't want to be on the video, don't line up the microphone. So I would now like to introduce the 4 panelists, and we're really happy and honored to have these 4 panelists, experts in their own area, which probably don't need much introduction, but I will introduce everybody as follows. Grant Sharfstein, QC, is on my immediate right. Grant has been practicing law in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan since 1979. He's appeared in all levels of court in Saskatchewan, including the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, and then in Alberta, in the Alberta Court of Appeal, the British Columbia Court of Appeal, the Federal Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada. He's been selected by his peers to be included in the best lawyers in Canada, and that has been ongoing since 2016 to present. In 2011, Grant appeared for the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission at the Supreme Court of Canada and made the argument in a historic hate speech case. Next we have to Grant's right, Ezan Gardi. Ezan is the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. He appears regularly on television, both locally and nationally, also in radio and in print journalism, speaking about issues related to Canadian Muslims, Islam, and civil liberties. He also speaks at numerous Canadian and global forums and at international conferences on public policy. In his professional capacity, Ezan has provided expert testimony in Parliament to both the House of Commons and the Senate on how proposed legislation, including most recently national security laws, could adversely impact civil liberties and diverse communities. Seated next to Ezan is Betty Ann Adam. Betty Ann is Dene. She's a member of the Fond du Lac First Nation. She is a child of the 60 Scoop and a longtime, very respected journalist in our province. The National Film Board of Canada and director Tasha Hubbard made the deeply moving documentary Birth of My Family. The documentary tells the story of Betty Ann and her lost siblings reuniting. In 2017, Betty Ann won the prestigious Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Best Text Feature for her story, Scooped: How I Lost My Mother, Found My Family, and Recovered My Identity. That particular article appeared in the Leader Post and the Star Phoenix, but in all National Post newspapers in Canada, including, of course, the nationally distributed National Post. Recently, Betty Ann retired from the Star Phoenix, and she's been freelancing for CBC and Eagle Feather News, and working with the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Saskatchewan to support survivors and draw forth their stories. Next, we have Dr. Fern Stockdale Winder. Fern is a PhD in psychology. She's a clinical psychologist who's been practicing psychology for more than 2 decades. She's worked in a variety of settings, including for 7 years as the professional leader of psychology and the director of clinical health psychology in the Saskatoon Health Region. In 2013, she was appointed Commissioner of the Mental Health and Addictions Action Plan and tasked by the Government of Saskatchewan with the job of leading a provincial review on mental health and addiction services in our province. Currently, she works as a frontline clinician in the Rehabilitation Center at Saskatoon City Hospital. We also have 2 designated responders with us tonight who will help to get the ball rolling on questions and answers when we get to that portion of the program. I'd like to introduce in the front row here, Heather Persson, the editor of the Saskatoon Star Phoenix and the Regina Leader-Post, and next to her, Dr. Michelle Pratula, the Dean of the College of Education here at the University of Saskatchewan. I want to thank the panelists in advance and the responders for being here tonight because I know they're going to contribute to a dynamic discussion on a very important issue. I thank all of you for coming, and I hope you'll be able to participate in the question and answer portion. Because hate speech is real, it's a genuine problem, and it's time we had a serious and frank, courageous conversation about it. Tonight we're going to talk about hate speech in the legal context, in the psychological context, and in the context of race, ethnicity, and religion. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about 3 critical reasons why courageous conversations are necessary in a healthy, free, and democratic society. First, hate speech is on the rise, not only in far-reaching parts of the world, but right here in Canada. Secondly, hate speech can lead and does lead to hate crime. This has been proven time and time again. Hate crime does not exist in a vacuum. Thirdly, at the moment, our country lacks mechanisms to effectively curb or regulate hate speech. These 3 factors together create a recipe for divisiveness, non-understanding, fear, and potential violence. We can't let this happen in this country. We must be proactive. Hate speech is on the rise. A couple of years ago, a media marketing company in Canada, Cision, conducted a study in this country, and in the study they found that between 2015 and 2016, in a 1-year, 12-month period, the amount of online intolerant hate speech increased by 600%. People were using hashtags like ban Muslim, Sieg Heil, white genocide, white power on platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and in comment sections and in blogs. A more recent survey released in January of 2019 by Leger Marketing for the Association of Canadian Studies shows that 60% of Canadians have seen hate speech on social media. Those numbers are both very unsettling, but in many ways not surprising. Social media has a tendency to supercharge hatred and hate speech. Platforms like Facebook that are designed to maximize user time promote posts that get the most attention. Unfortunately, posts and comments that tap into negative, primal emotions like hate and fear produced the highest engagement. That's why time and time again, communal hatred seemingly overruns our news feeds. Social media amplifies our tendency towards tribalism. Posts that promote hate, comments that divide the world into this us and them, often spread like wildfire. As an example, a few weeks ago, in a tragic house fire in Halifax, the lives of 7 Muslim children were claimed. In the community, Halifax, people banded together, they took part in a vigil, and they raised more than $700,000 for the grieving parents of those children in a very short period of time. But contrast this, online, some people laughed. Some others left hateful comments like, "A whole family of Muslims decimated, good job. We're tired of paying for them, good riddance." Things escalated to the point where a news channel in Quebec was forced to remove the story from its social media because of those hateful comments. Closer to home, think about what happened online after the homicide of Colton Bushy, and again after the verdict was rendered in the criminal case. The social media situation in Saskatchewan at that time became very corrosive. So corrosive, in fact, that the RCMP conducted a hate speech investigation. But note, to date, no charges have been laid. I'll discuss that in a few seconds. Right now, let's talk about the relationship between hate speech and hate crime. Hate speech begets hate crime. Some people believe that words are just words, that words alone don't really mean anything, and words alone don't matter. That's fundamentally and patently false. Words do matter. Words have the power to shame, maim, and blame. Words can create trauma. Hate speech is the impetus that leads to hate crime. We witnessed evidence of that in 2017 when a gunman entered a Quebec mosque and murdered 6 innocent Muslims and injured 19 others at prayer. We witnessed it again last year in the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the history of the United States. The gunman in Pittsburgh left a digital footprint infused with malice, ignorance, and hate, a footprint which leaves little doubt that in extreme cases, hate thought begets hate speech, which in turn begets hate crime. History provides countless other examples of hate speech and related violence. Hate speech, when left unchecked and unchallenged, has led to terrible and tragic ends. The Holocaust did not begin in a vacuum after Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Its roots were planted much earlier. The Holocaust began with words. Words, in fact, do matter. At that time, Hitler and the Nazis, through acts and through laws, isolated the Jewish community, boycotted Jewish businesses, created a sense of otherness, and dehumanized Jewish people. In the 1980s, Slobodan Milosevic used nationalist propaganda and fanned the flames of hatred, which resulted in the murder of thousands of Serbian forces, masked in a soft term, ethnic cleansing. In other words, words do matter, and they come from various perspectives. In Rwanda, hate speech disseminated in the media prepared Rwanda's killing and willing executioners and paved the way for genocide in 1994. More recently in Myanmar, hate speech and misinformation spread via social media promoted hatred of Muslims and dehumanized Myanmar's Rohingya population. Facebook posts dehumanized the Rohingya as dogs and rapists. Many people in Myanmar called for those individuals to be shot and set on fire. One person in that area said the same thing, which follows as this: we must fight them the way Hitler did the Jews. This type of hate-fueled dehumanization laid the foundation for a government crackdown characterized by religious persecution, murder, arbitrary arrest, rape, and forced the displacement of more than 720,000 refugees. These are the large-scale examples of how hate speech can lead to unspeakable acts. On a smaller but no less important scale, riots, lynchings, and other forms of violence around the world continue links to misinformation and hate speech. So what are we to do? Here in Canada, how do we counter the rise of hate speech that we are witnessing and decrease the likelihood of hate speech evolving into hate crimes? We can start by remedying the third reason the Commission felt courageous conversations were necessary. At the moment, our country lacks the mechanisms to curb and regulate hate speech. Earlier, I mentioned that after the verdict in the Colten Bushy homicide, the RCMP launched a hate speech investigation under Section 319 of the Criminal Code. I also mentioned that no charges were laid. That is because hate occupies a very murky corner in Canadian criminal jurisprudence. The burden of proof is very high in criminal law. The conviction rate on hate speech is very low. Prosecutors have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt a motivation and an intent. And that is a very high threshold, reasonable doubt. It means proof of certainty of the issue by about 95, 96, 97%. It's a very, very high threshold. It's extremely difficult to prove, and the court records demonstrate that. This is why the Supreme Court of Canada asserts that the best, most effective way to curb and regulate hate speech is not within the criminal code, it is through human rights commissions with human rights codes, because we use a civil procedure, and the burden of proof in civil procedure is proof on a balance of probabilities, which is 51-49 if you think of it as a teeter-totter. So it's a lower threshold and more likely to produce a liability on behalf of a perpetrator. I totally agree with the Supreme Court of Canada's comments on this, but there's another problem, and that is that only 4 jurisdictions out of 13 provinces and territories in Canada have human rights codes that explicitly refer to hate speech in a really robust manner. Saskatchewan leads the way. We have the strongest legislation against hate speech. What's more, in 2012, and this is very important, the Private Members Bill repealed Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act and effectively removed hate speech from that act. That has to change. To properly deal with hate speech in our country, Section 13 needs to be put back into the Canadian Human Rights Act. Many people don't realize that, but the federal government has no law which effectively deals with hate speech. So it's an imperative to change that. It's also an imperative for each province and territory to amend its human rights codes and their various acts to include hate speech provisions across the board from coast to coast in this country. Canada must regulate hate speech online. In Europe, both the British government is drafting a plan, as is the German government, to legislate mechanisms which would effectively deal with hate speech. What they're thinking of doing is something that Karina Gold, the Minister of Democratic Reform in Canada, or Democratic Institutions, said she expects to look at it. So what they do is this. They penalize the platform, for instance, Facebook, anytime that platform disseminates hate speech. So they're talking about fines and putting the platforms on notice that they're legally responsible when they host information to make sure that hate speech isn't part of that information. So that's something that I think we might see in Canada if others follow suit. So it's time for the government in Canada to, in fact, follow the leads of others. It's also time for our governments provincially and federally to invest in education. What we need is an explicit K-12 pedagogy designed to produce good citizens. What does that mean to be a good citizen? It means you have rights of citizenship, but also responsibilities that go with those rights. And one of the fundamental responsibilities of citizens, certainly in Canada, is this: respect every person, respect every citizen. Why? Because every human being deserves equal moral consideration. It also means embodying the 5 essential Canadian citizenship competencies. And those are to be an enlightened citizen, an ethical citizen, an engaged citizen, an empowered citizen, and an empathetic citizen. Students and citizens who embody these characteristics will be able to withstand hate propaganda and will be equipped to counter hate speech when it arises. The best part is that such an education material already exists. No need for further research or curriculum creation. It exists because that curriculum was created by the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and is available for every grade in every school in Saskatchewan. It was done along with leaders in Saskatchewan, including the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan School Boards Association, the SDF, the College of Education at the University of Regina, and importantly, the Ministry of Education, who was a partner in creating those materials. They're now housed under the rubric of consented citizenship education, and they're available to teach what we call the 3 R's and the 5 E's that I've mentioned. These resources are currently being used in a number of Saskatchewan classrooms, and particularly in this city, Saskatoon Public School Division and Saskatoon Catholic School Division are leading the province in the adopting of these materials and resources for all classrooms. To curb hate speech, we need an educated and engaged citizenry. We need government to take a leading role on many fronts, and we need to regulate hate speech found in the fever swamps of social media. And we need to band together, rise above hate, and make the world a better place. Hate speech and hate crimes divide, disenfranchise, and destabilize our society. So take it upon yourself to do what is right. When you witness hate speech, don't ignore it, counter it. When you encounter a hateful idea, challenge it. To paraphrase many philosophers over the ages, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. I thank you for your attention. I now turn the podium over to Grant Scharfstein, and in turn each one of the panelists, and then we'll move to the response and then question and answers. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. I'm going to give a sort of a legal overview of the issues of hate speech in Canada. And the issue of hate speech in Canada doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's an issue because of other concepts that I want to talk about for a minute first. And the first is the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech. What is that? Why should we care about that? And who in the first place says we have the right to freedom of expression anyway? That'll be our starting point, and the answer is, in Canada, Part 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This document contains freedoms, fundamental freedoms, to everyone. And if the federal government or any provincial government passed laws that are contrary to what's stated in the Charter, those laws will be struck down and they're of no force and effect. So what are these fundamental freedoms that we as each Canadian are entitled to? First is freedom of conscience and religion. Second is freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. Third, freedom of peaceful assembly, and fourth, freedom of association. These are fundamental freedoms that we in Canada have all been given. We're going to focus a bit on the freedom of expression. And why is it so important? Now, freedom of expression is a centerpiece of democratic rights and freedoms. In its very first session in 1946, before any human rights declarations or treaties had been adopted, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 59 stating, "Freedom of information is a fundamental human right and the touchstone of all freedoms to which the United Nations is consecrated." Freedom of expression is essential in enabling democracy to work and to allow for public participation in decision-making. Citizens cannot exercise their right to vote effectively or to take part in public decision-making if they do not have free access to information and ideas and are not entitled or free to express their views freely. Freedom of expression is thus not only important for individual dignity, but also to participation, accountability, and democracy. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on December 10, 1948, and provides human rights standards accepted by all member states, of which Canada is, of course, one. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights represents the normative basis that led to formulating the standards that we have for freedom of expression. Article 19 says, "Everyone has the right to the freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. Without the free flow of this information, society doesn't function, or it functions very poorly. A closed, censored society will soon become something like an autocracy or dictatorship with corruption and frightened servants instead of citizens." I need mention North Korea, Syria, Iran as examples of how that would be. Whether they like it or not, the people in power need criticism and open information. As Lord Acton put it years ago, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. In 1990, the Supreme Court of Canada had occasion to talk about the importance of freedom of expression in the Keegstra hate case, of which I'll speak a little bit more about in a few moments. Chief Justice Dickson of the Supreme Court stated, "The freedom to express oneself openly and fully is of crucial importance in a free and democratic society like Canada. It is an essential value of Canadian parliamentary democracy. Freedom of expression was entrenched in our Constitution and is guaranteed so as to ensure that everyone can manifest their thoughts, opinions, beliefs, indeed all expression of the heart and mind, however unpopular, distasteful, or contrary to the mainstream. Such protection is fundamental because in a free and pluralistic and democratic society, we prize a diversity of ideas and opinions for their inherent value both to the community and to the individual. So there you are. We're entitled to freedom of expression, and it can be distasteful, contrary to the mainstream, unpopular. So are there any restrictions on this freedom of expression? That is the fundamental principle. And more importantly, should there be? Well, the answer is yes, there are restrictions. I'll mention 2 or 3, and then we'll get into the hate provisions in some little more detail. First, obviously, the common law in Canada imposes penalties and sanctions against any expression that's defamatory. If I defame somebody or say something, that's my freedom of expression to say it, but if it's defamatory, I can be sued, and courts will prevent you from doing that. That's obviously a limit on my freedom of expression. This has existed for centuries. Second, we have the Criminal Code of Canada, and Commissioner Arnott has talked a bit about that, and it has provisions making it a criminal offense to say or express certain things. Section 319 of the Criminal Code of Canada provides, in part, everyone who, by communicating statements in any public place, incites hatred against any identifiable group where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace, is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years. In subpart 2 of 319, everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversations, willfully promotes hatred against any identifiable group is guilty of an indictable offense subject to imprisonment of not to exceed 2 years. There are defenses in the Act, in the Criminal Code, to that offense. And as Commissioner Arnott has indicated, it is almost impossible to get a conviction in Canada under the Criminal Code. There have been a few, but they are far and few between because of the standard and the test you have to meet for a criminal conviction. Third, there are restrictions on freedom of expression found in various human rights acts, such as Saskatchewan, until recently, the Federal Human Rights Code. And it's this aspect I want to talk about a little bit more this evening. Section 14 of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code provides as follows. In part, no person shall publish or display or cause or permit to be published or displayed in any printed matter or publication or by means of any other medium, any representation that exposes or tends to expose to hatred any person or class of persons on the basis of a prohibited ground. Now, prohibited grounds are grounds of religion, creed, marital status, family status, sex, sexual orientation, disability, age, color, ancestry, nationality, place of origin, race or perceived race, receipt of public assistance, and gender identity. Now, there's no doubt, and there's no question, that Section 14B of the Human Rights Code in Saskatchewan violates our fundamental right under Section 2(1)B of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to our freedom of expression. That's admitted. The Supreme Court of Canada has determined that. And when we argued the Whatcott case in the Supreme Court, we didn't deny that. It's obviously a restriction on what you can say. So how can it stand? How can it be enforceable? Because that was the issue before the Supreme Court. Was it constitutional? There were many trying to strike it down. Well, let's go back to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for a minute to highlight a section that's even more important than the Section 2 fundamental freedoms, and that is Section 1 of our Charter. And it says, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. This limitation on freedom of expression is crucial and essential. So for Section 14 of the Human Rights Code to be constitutionally valid and legally enforceable, The court had to be convinced that this restriction on freedom of expression, the restriction that you cannot publish anything hateful, has to be seen as demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So is the prohibition of hate speech justifiable in a free and democratic society? There's many who say no. In the Supreme Court case of Whatcott, I think there were something like 20-some or 29 interveners who intervened in that case, the largest number in Canadian history in the Supreme Court of Canada, many of them arguing the American model of freedom of expression. Let me say whatever I want, whenever I want, to whoever I want, whyever I want. And if it's wrong or they don't like it, they have the right to express their view too. But the Supreme Court of Canada says, yes, it is proper to have that. It is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And here's why they say that. There exists in Canada persons and organizations extremist in outlook and dedicated to the preaching and spreading of hatred and contempt against certain identifiable minorities in Canada. And even though this group may not be large, it must be checked because what is known to have been the result of hate propaganda in other countries and our own, particularly in Germany as an example in the 1930s, which led to the Holocaust, the systemic murder of 6 million Jews, 1.5 million of which were children. It all started with hate speech. I'm going to read something out of today's Saskatoon Star Phoenix, a plug for the Star Phoenix. It's an editorial, and I'll tell you the author after I read it. You'll be maybe a bit surprised. A challenge to visionary leadership in Canada and elsewhere is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is born in ignorance and nurtured in envy. It is the stepchild of delusion and evil. The ongoing success of Canada's Jewish community is consequently often misunderstood, misrepresented, and misinterpreted and misreported. The rise in the number of attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions in Canada testify to the intractability of the problem and the constant need for vigilance, consistency, and strength in dealing with the entire sweep of anti-Semitism. In Dante's Inferno, it is noted that the hottest place in hell is reserved for those who, in times of great moral crisis, strive to maintain their neutrality. In fact, ambivalence on an issue of such importance is for the cowardly, which is why each of us must stand up and be counted, and why our elected leaders cannot duck or dodge. Anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise everywhere, including in this country, where there was reported 26% increase in events, such as harassment, vandalism, and violence. And the hate crimes perpetrated against the Muslim community, I think, are at an even greater rate of increase over the last 2 years in this country. Only if Canada reaches out to our youth to obliterate anti-Semitism will real progress be made in a manner that will honor our citizenship in the splendid country of which we are all so proud. And the individual who made this speech concluded by saying, from the bloodied sands of Afghanistan to the pristine snows and surging waters of the high Arctic and everything in between, the Canada of 50 years from now will be defined by the leadership we are given today. If all of us remember that freedom and liberty and the protection of minority rights are the very pillars of our national democracy, we can collectively make a contribution to the well-being of mankind that will bring honor to Canada and peace and prosperity to all our citizens. That was a speech given 3 days ago by Brian Mulroney in Ottawa. And it's very true. It's very real. You can look at the Tutsi slaughter in Rwanda. That started with hate speech. It was started with hate speech to stigmatize and dehumanize the Tutsi. It always starts with hate speech and hate propaganda. I mentioned the Keegstra case a little earlier. Jim Keegstra, if you don't recall, was a teacher in Alberta, in the high school, who taught his students that Jews had evil qualities, that they were treacherous, subversive, sadistic, money-loving child killers, and he was a denier of the Holocaust. He was charged with promoting hatred under Section 319 of the Criminal Code, and the Supreme Court upheld his conviction. In the Keegstra decision, Chief Justice Dixon said the following about the injury caused by hate speech. Essentially, there are two sorts of injury caused by hate speech. First, there is harm done to members of the target group. It is indisputable that the emotional damage caused by words may be of grave psychological and social consequence. In the context of sexual harassment, for example, this court has found that words can in themselves constitute harassment. In a similar matter, words and writings that willfully promote hatred can constitute a serious attack on persons belonging to a racial or religious group, and these persons are humiliated and degraded. The court went on to say, a person's sense of human dignity and belonging to the community at large is closely linked to the concern and respect accorded the groups to which he or she belongs. The derision, hostility, and abuse encouraged by hate propaganda therefore have a severely negative impact on the individual's self-worth and acceptance. And this impact may cause the target group members to take drastic measures in reaction, perhaps avoiding activities which bring them into contact with non-group members, or adopting attitudes and postures directed towards blending with the majority. But a second harmful effect of hate propaganda, which is of pressing and substantial concern in Canada, is its influence upon society at large. Individuals can be persuaded to believe almost anything if information or ideas are communicated using the right technique and in the proper circumstances. The court goes on to say, we are less confident in the 20th century, now 21st century, that the critical faculties of individuals will be brought to bear on speech and writing which is directed at them. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a widespread belief that man was a rational creature and that if his mind was trained and liberated from superstition by education, he would always distinguish truth from falsehood, right from wrong. We cannot, and this is the court speaking, we cannot share this faith today in such a simple form. While holding that over the long run the human mind is repelled by blatant falsehood and seeks good, it is too often true in the short run that emotion displaces reason and individuals perversely reject the demonstrations of truth put before them and forsake the good they know. The success of modern advertising, the triumphs of impudent propaganda such as Hitler's have qualified sharply our belief in the rationality of man. We know that under the strain and pressure in times of irritation and frustration, the individual is swayed and even swept away by hysterical emotional appeals. We act irresponsibly if we ignore the way in which emotion can drive reason from the field. And I think we need look no further than to our neighbor to the south to see that happening. Chief Justice Dickson continued, "It is thus not inconceivable that the active dissemination of hate propaganda can attract individuals to its cause and in the process create serious discord between various cultural groups in society. Moreover, the alteration of views held by the recipients of hate propaganda may occur subtly and is not always attendant upon conscious acceptance of the communicated ideas. Even if the message of hate propaganda is outwardly rejected, there is evidence that the premise of racial or religious inferiority may persist in a recipient's mind as an idea that holds some truth, an incipient effect not to be entirely discounted. The threat to the self-dignity of the target group members is thus matched by the possibility that prejudice messages will gain some credence, with the attendant result of discrimination and perhaps even violence against minority groups in Canadian society. We have all too many examples of that. The court went on to say the problem is a serious one. We believe that given a certain set of socioeconomic circumstances, such as a deepening of the emotional tensions or the setting in of a severe business recession, public susceptibility might well increase significantly. Moreover, the potential psychological and social damage of hate propaganda, both to a desensitized majority and to the sensitive minority target group, is incalculable. He concluded by saying, the harm caused by hate propaganda represents a pressing and substantial concern in a free and democratic society. And that is why it is justifiable to have anti-hate laws in a free and democratic society. But the key question has not yet been asked or answered in the context of the prohibition against hate speech. Most everyone, even the haters, are going to say, yeah, hate speech is bad, people shouldn't speak hate about anybody. The real question, the real issue is, what is hate speech? Well, I can give you the legal answer. Thanks to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and Commissioner Arnott, we had the ability to argue this in the Supreme Court of Canada. And in 2013, the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission took a case to the Supreme Court to determine the question as to whether the prohibition against hate speech in our Saskatchewan Human Rights Code was constitutionally valid and enforceable. Bill Whatcott was found liable under the anti-hate speech provisions in the code of exposing or tending to expose gay people to hatred by circulating 4 flyers in Saskatchewan making various claims against gay people. The following extracts from the flyers appeared. Talked about children learning how wonderful it is for 2 men to sodomize each other. Says now the homosexuals want to share their filth and propaganda with Saskatchewan's children. Talks about degenerated into a filthy session where gay and lesbian teachers use dirty language to describe lesbian sex and sodomy to their teenage audience. And finally, he said, our children will pay the price in disease, death, and abuse if we do not say no to the sodomite desire to socialize your children into accepting something that is clearly wrong. These are but a few examples of what was contained in these flyers, hundreds of them that he circulated. I believe it was in Regina. The Supreme Court of Canada, in a unanimous decision, determined that the provision in the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code against hate speech violated the constitutional guarantee of freedom of expression. But the section was valid and enforceable as justifiable in a free and democratic society because of the harm hate speech causes. And the court then went on to define what hate speech is. It's hate speech if, and I quote, if in the view of a reasonable person, aware of the context and circumstances, the expression exposes or tends to expose any person or class of persons to detestation and vilification on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination. Put another way, hatred is restricted to those extreme manifestations of emotions described by the words detestation and vilification. The court stated, this filters out expressions which, while repugnant and offensive, does not incite to the level of abhorrence, delegitimization, and rejection that risks causing discrimination or other harmful effects. The term hatred contained in a legislative hate speech prohibition should be applied objectively to determine whether a reasonable person aware of the circumstances would view it as exposing a person to detestation and vilification. It is only when it rises to this level that it's hate speech in our law. It can be offensive, it can be belittling, it can be obnoxious, it can be rude, it can be hurtful. Doesn't make it hate. Speech rises to this level when it describes a group as less than human, not worthy of being equal, and somehow says to them, you are different, you are not worthy of being here, you are not welcome, you are not one of us. As stated in Whatcott, hate speech is an effort to marginalize individuals based on their membership in a group. Using expressions that exposes the group to hatred, hate speech seeks to delegitimize group members in the eyes of the majority, reducing their social standing and acceptance within society. And I will add that it also removes the ability of those who are the targets of hate speech from expressing their own views and takes away their ability to express and have their freedom of expression and thought, and thereby thwarts the entire concept of hate speech or freedom of expression itself. So in conclusion, yes, freedom of expression is essential in a free and democratic society. Without it, we are not free and democratic at all. But this does not, should not, and cannot allow for the dissemination of hate because of the harm that hate causes. You've probably all heard the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. A more erroneous and false statement has never been made. Bones heal, but the hurt and harm caused by hate speech can not only last a lifetime, it can lead to physical harm and ultimately genocide. It is incalculable to determine the number of people murdered over the centuries where such an atrocity had its genesis in hate speech and propaganda. It all starts with hate speech. So let's stop it at that stage before it becomes another atrocity. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. I greet you with a traditional Muslim greeting. And following that, how do you follow that and get up on the podium after that? Well, you start by saying, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs. Thank you very much, Judge David, for the very kind introduction you gave. It was just as my mother would have written it. As he said, I'm from Ottawa, where all of your tax dollars literally go up in smoke every Canada Day, so thank you for that with the fireworks. And thank you as well to our generous host this evening, the University of Saskatchewan, Dean Dr. Partula, and to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission team, and to all the volunteers who made tonight possible. It's an honor to speak alongside such accomplished people as my fellow panelists, and I want to thank each of you as well for taking the time to come out on a Thursday night. You have shared with us your most valuable resource, your time. Judge David told me I've been given about 15 minutes or so to speak, but clearly he didn't speak to my better half, who would have told him it takes me that long to clear my throat. I was asked to share a few thoughts tonight about the impact of hate speech on Canadian Muslim communities and the state of Islamophobia in Canada. But before we can understand the impact of hate speech and the state of Islamophobia, I believe it's important to know about whom are we talking. According to the 2011 National Household Survey, Muslims comprised approximately 3.2% of the population, or a little over 1 million people. And extrapolating from this and the growth rates, current estimates are anywhere between 1.5 to 1.8 million Muslims in Canada, with the vast majority living in the major urban centers of what we call TMV, or Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, with larger populations in other cities like Calgary, Edmonton, London, Windsor, and Ottawa. Muslims are also the fastest growing faith group in Canada and are estimated that they will form about 6.8% of the population by 2030, at which point the population is expected to level off in growth and to be more similar to the rest of the population. Here in Saskatoon, I'm told there are approximately 15,000 Muslims, and the first mosque built in Canada was the Al-Rashid Mosque, which was established in 1938 in Edmonton, and the first recorded birth of a Muslim in Canada occurred 13 years prior to Confederation and was the son of James and Agnes Love, two Scottish immigrants who were converts. So as I like to say in my presentations, when Islam came to Canada, love came to Canada. It sounds a lot better when I do it in my Barry White voice impression. Muslims are as diverse as any other group of Canadians and range from conservative to liberal in their practice, to culturally identifying only, and come from a variety of national, ethnic, linguistic, racial, and other backgrounds. In my presentations about Muslims and Islam, I like to paraphrase Forrest Gump. Muslims are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. But getting back to tonight's topic, if there are only two things that you remember from my talk tonight, they would be this. One, hate speech and hateful speech can and do have serious consequences. We need to be prepared to combat both and use appropriate tools to do so, while at the same time respecting and vigorously defending our cherished and hard-won right to free expression. Secondly, hate speech and hate crimes pose a threat not just to the communities or individuals they target, but to our very social fabric. As such, everyone has a role to play in combating hatred, including government, law enforcement, civil society organizations, and each of you. It cannot be effectively fought or left to one community to address. We've all heard the statistics about the rise in hatred targeting different communities across this country, and Muslims are no different. In 2017, hate crimes against Muslims rose sharply, up 151% from the previous year, about 349 cases, or maybe one every day. Anti-Muslim hate crimes accounted for about 17% of all crimes in Canada. Reported hate crimes targeting Jews rose 63%, and they remain the most frequently targeted religious community, accounting for 18% of such crimes. Hate crimes impacting the Black community increased by 50%, accounting for 16% of reported incidents, and this is just a few groups. However, the numbers only tell a partial story, as we know from Statistics Canada that up to 2/3 of hate crimes go unreported for a host of reasons, including fear of retaliation, a lack of trust in police, a different perception of law enforcement, especially from newcomers who come from countries where law enforcement is the last people you call when you have a problem, and a belief that reporting may not make a difference, as well as other barriers to reporting, to name a few. When we're talking about hate crime data, we face not only the challenge of underreporting, but also under-recording. Fluctuations may have as much to do with the likelihood of communities to report as they do with the likelihood of law enforcement to take it seriously enough to record these as incidents as such. In general, at least in Ontario, I can't speak for Saskatchewan, police reporting, we have noted, is erratic. Some police services will record all incidents, and some of them will only record incidents that rise to the level of criminal behavior. These numbers also do not reflect how people who have multiple identities are impacted by hatred and discrimination through the phenomenon of intersectionality. For example, a Black Muslim woman convert will likely experience sexism, Islamophobia, and anti-Black racism from both outside as well as inside the Muslim community. Police services that do record these incidents can also only check one box for a motivating factor of an incident. This data regarding the rise in Islamophobia also comes at a time when we know that the phenomenon of right-wing extremist groups is on the rise. According to research by Dr. Barbara Perry and Professor Ryan Scrivens, between 2015 and 2018, the number of hate groups, or right-wing extremist groups active across this country increased by as much as 25%. But now Dr. Perry says that that might have been a conservative estimate. In an interview she gave in the Toronto Star, she said, "Now that we've started to sort the list of groups and name them, we're getting close to 300 groups," noting that the group number also includes multiple chapters of the same umbrella group. These groups are of varying sizes and levels of organization and sophistication, such as one group called La Meute, or the Wolf Pack in Quebec, which has over 40,000 Facebook friends. When it comes to Islamophobia, the most vivid and recent example of how hatred left unchecked can result in tragedy was the horrific terrorist attack that took place in Quebec City just over 2 years ago, which claimed the lives of Ibrahima Berry, age 39, Mamadou Tanou Berry, age 42, Khalid Belkacemi, age 60, Abu Bakr Thebti, age 44, Abdel Karim Hassani, age 41, and Azadine Soufiane, age 57. This, for me, was one of my most difficult days as ED of the NCCM. I felt as though we had failed the Muslim community, despite having sounded the alarm bells and screaming at the top of our lungs about the rise in hate crimes and hate incidents, as well as hate speech and hateful rhetoric. We need look no further than the words of the killer himself, Alexandre Bissonnette, for confirmation from videos from his interrogation. Quote, "I was watching TV and I learned that the Canadian government was going to take more refugees, who couldn't go to the United States, and they were coming here," Mr. Bissonnette explained. "I saw that and I lost my mind. It was then I decided it was time to go." Mr. Bissonnette's anti-immigrant views are clearly political, and his conflation of Muslims and terrorism are based on fear and hatred. This incident did not come about in a vacuum. As I recently wrote in an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail on February 8th, I attended the sentencing hearing for Mr. Bissonnette. This was another difficult day. The judge began by recounting minute by minute, bullet by bullet, how Bissonnette went on his shooting rampage, killing 2 of his victims execution style. He then went on to relate stories about how the 6 widows and 17 orphans of the 6 men had been impacted. He talked about how one of the daughters of the deceased had dug at the sand in his native Algeria where he was buried, desperately trying to see her father one last time. It was painful to hear, and I can only imagine how painful it was for the families. As Canadians, many have smugly talked about and written about the impact of nativist rhetoric emerging from different parts of the world, and of course, and perhaps most obviously, from our neighbors to the south under the current US presidency, and the resultant rise in hate targeting various communities. Unfortunately, here in Canada, we are not immune. During the last federal election, we saw firsthand the cultivation of Islamophobic politics under Stephen Harper, whether it was the ban on face veils at citizenship ceremonies or the proposed so-called Barbaric Cultural Practices Act that vilified and marginalized Canadian Muslims. More recently, and just days after the second anniversary of the shootings in Quebec City, where the government is about to introduce and likely pass a new law banning individuals in the public service, such as teachers from wearing religious attire like the hijab. Just 2 days after the second anniversary of the shootings in Quebec, which he attended, Premier Legault outrageously suggested that Islamophobia does not exist in Quebec. This was followed a few weeks afterwards when his Minister for the Status of Women claimed that the Muslim hijab was, quote, a symbol of oppression, unquote. While without scientifically rigorous empirical study, it is difficult to draw direct causal connections, I can tell you that at the NCCM, we have noted a consistent pattern year after year that whenever Muslims and Islam are in the public discourse in a negative way, the number of hate crimes and hate incidents reported to our organization rise. To help track these numbers in 2013, and the NCCM launched our online hate crimes and hate incidents map, which you can visit at our website, nccm.ca/map. Shameless plug. But of course, this is only telling a partial picture as well. So yes, our elected officials have a role to play in how they talk about vulnerable communities. As the expression goes, with great power comes great responsibility. And the language that they and other figures deemed to be authorities and subject matter experts use can be interpreted by some as license to act out on their own hateful thoughts and ideologies. We've seen this before, we've seen this both here, but we've also seen it abroad as well, as in the manifesto written by the Norwegian terrorist Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people. In his manifesto, he cited numerous prominent anti-Muslim figures and pundits as his inspiration, in which he praised, including individuals like Richard Spencer, who runs the blog Jihad Watch, and Pamela Geller, who gained notoriety after the so-called Ground Zero mosque controversy. Both of these individuals, of course, unsurprisingly, refuted any link to Breivik after he committed his massacre. The need to exercise free expression responsibly also extends to our media as well. At the NCCM, we like to say that the media both mirror as well as manufacture the narrative in the public discourse about different issues. And I'll give you an anecdote to illustrate. In April of 2018, when the Toronto van attack devastated lives and turned a city's sense of safety on its head, a single deeply irresponsible tweet by a CBC reporter and TV broadcaster Natasha Fatah instantly set alight a fire of racism and xenophobia. This reporter ignored basic journalistic standards when she decided to partially report an eyewitness account to her 40,000 Twitter followers, stating that the suspect looked, quote, wide-eyed, angry, and Middle Eastern. As has been documented, the tweet went viral and was shared and retweeted by prominent figures in the Islamophobia and alt-right cosmos. 45 minutes after her original tweet, Ms. Fatah tweeted out that another witness had said that the suspect was white. It was only after significant community pressure, including from the NCCM and a letter to the CBC brass, did Ms. Fatah issue an apology at 4 a.m. in the morning, and then only 2 full weeks after the initial tweet. The NCCM later met with the CBC chief editor and senior editorial staff, and while a public apology was not made by the CBC, there was an acknowledgement given that this type of reporting was deeply problematic. Another example that illustrates this was a story that came out of Quebec, where TVA reported that female construction workers had been banned from being near a mosque during Friday services. And this was actually found to be completely false, but the news outlet insisted that their sources were valid and only later apologized when they realized that the sources were not as accurate as they had deemed at the time. However, by that time, the damage had been done. And you can't put that genie back in the bottle. We know that the media has disproportionately played up terrorist attacks committed by Muslims compared to those committed by others. According to a recent research from the University of Alabama, terror attacks committed by Muslims receive 357% more press attention than attacks by non-Muslims, garnering an average of 105 headlines and others just 15. So we know that elected officials and certain media outlets play a role in the broader business of propagating and pushing out Islamophobia. At the same time, make no mistake, there is a cottage industry dedicated to promoting and pushing out Islamophobic rhetoric, myths and misperceptions about Muslims, and it is a very lucrative one at that. Bashing Muslims is good business, and I'd be happy to discuss this aspect in more detail during our Q&A and to let you know a little bit more about the research NCCM is undertaking in this area in Canada. All age groups experience the impact of Islamophobia, but perhaps most hurtful is when it targets the young. The NCCM conducted a town hall for students in Ontario which brought together students from different school boards to talk about their experiences and how they felt, not only when targeted by hate directed at them, but also by their concerns and anxieties that they can't make mistakes and are looked at as ambassadors for their entire faith community to speak and justify themselves when something happens involving anyone who identifies as Muslims. But it's not all doom and gloom, and there is light at the end of the tunnel and a reason for hope. After the Quebec City shooting, and more recently the shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and other horrific incidents, we've seen Canadians come out and speak out against these types of incidents and the fertile ground provided by the discourse of hatred and xenophobia. Rings of peace were formed around mosques after Quebec City, and the same occurred around synagogues after Pittsburgh. So moving forward, what is needed and what is the NCCM doing? Firstly, continued community action. One example is a recent NCCM Storytellers Retreat. Last month, through a grant we received from the InSpirit Foundation, NCCM brought together over 30 Muslim storytellers, including journalists, artists, and others from across Canada to share their ideas and about best practices and how to change the predominant narratives about Muslims as being either victims or aggressors. The NCCM has also called for January 29th to be designated as a day of action on hate and intolerance so that we can work together as Canadians every year and measure our progress on combating hate and reflect on what is working and what isn't. This is not merely meant as a symbolic gesture, but as a reminder as well of the devastating consequences that can transpire when hate goes unchecked. In the last year, NCCM has also been to over 79 schools and conducted its Teachable Moment on Islamophobia workshop in Ontario, reaching over 4,000 teachers, student teachers, and students as well. Unfortunately, with the election of the new government in Ontario, this grant hasn't been renewed, but we still have incredible interest from school boards across the province and are also hopeful that we can continue to provide these workshops. We've received interest in them from different parts of the country, including Alberta and from other parts of the world, and we're also hopeful of the same response here in Saskatchewan. We also need government action. The government has been undertaking, as many of you know, a study of racism and xenophobia, and it must use this to update the previously mothballed version of the Canada Action Plan against racism. This includes implementing a federal anti-racism directorate to coordinate with its provincial counterparts where they exist, and where they don't, serious consideration should be given to the creation of such bodies. I would argue that there's both a social harmony component to the logic of doing this, but also an economic component. By working early to eradicate hatred and hate-motivated crimes, especially among young people, who also tend to be the most common perpetrators, we're also keeping individuals and cases out of the judicial and quasi-judicial realms, as well as the correctional services sector. A catch them while they're young approach, if you will. Finally, we also need to look at developing a strategy to tackle online hate. We need to survey the models being employed around the world, such as the one in Germany, but not just copy and paste them here in Canada. We need to develop a made-in-Canada solution. And finally, individual action. Each of you must take personal responsibility to speak out when you see and hear racism and hatred. Only when we see this as our own challenge and not just someone else's problem, and unite with one another, will we begin to effectively challenge this growing phenomenon. Refuse to be a bystander and instead be an upstander. It's up to you. Thank you.
Is this mic on? Is the mic on? It is on? Can you, is the mic on, or maybe it's just not close enough? Yeah. I decided not to go stand up there, so I'm just going to sit and talk to you from here. Those were amazing, well-organized, and powerful, strong arguments and comments, and thank you for that. And so now you'll get some less organized thoughts about hate speech. When David asked me to join this panel, I thought this was an interesting challenge because for me, of course, as an Indigenous person, my mind immediately went to the online hate speech that came out after Colton Boushie was shot to death by Gerald Stanley. And so for me, it's just such an emotional thing that I have a hard time sometimes just separating myself. And as a journalist, you know, you always have to keep yourself separate from the story. You have to keep your feelings separate. And that's why from the moment it happened, I didn't report on the story at all. And of course, Heather's here. She was the editor, and I think she understood that it was so astonishing that I couldn't bring that necessary detachment to the story. So I'm just going to tell you, you know, I think there's been some excellent comment about hate speech and about hate speech in Canada. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the details of the hate speech that we saw in regard to the Boushie case. I'll start with that. And after when the news release came out from the RCMP that a man had been killed, that somebody had been killed out by Biggar, the very first news release included the information that 3 of the people who were with the victim of the homicide had been arrested on suspicion of theft. And for me right there, that is the beginning of hate speech. I think hate speech, while I think it happens on a continuum, and at the far extreme end of it are those statements which incite people to violence and derision and all of the things that we've heard it described. But I think that hate speech on the other end of the continuum are the subtle messages that we also have to be aware of. And so the RCMP, when they put out that news release, whoever it was that wrote that news release probably didn't even realize that he was providing a justification for the accused in a way that he would never have done. And I truly believe this, and I'll just state it as a fact, that he would not have done if the offender had been Indigenous. The defense, and sure enough, when the most egregious of the Facebook, maybe it's most famous because there was a Facebook group called Farmers with Firearms, and so they clearly identified themselves that way, and so that was a place where people went to see what they were saying. And Rob Innes, one of the professors here at the university, took screen grabs of that Facebook page and shared them with me and with others, of course. And so that's why we have a record of what was said on that page. And so I'm sure there were other people who took screen grabs of on other pages and such. But there were a group of people talking on the Facebook page, and then someone pointed out right away. It was I think it was Darwin Choquette, or possibly I think it was Kane Robertson, who said, that there was, someone had been shot, and it was one of his neighbors. One of his neighbors had been accused, was said to have shot someone. And that's right. He said it was his neighbor, and he said, it's about time something happened. Maybe it'll make them think. So that was like immediately. He said that immediately. And in within that same thread, Christopher Roy Benke seized on that statement in the RCMP news release and said that he declared that they had that they'd been charged with theft. So he went beyond the suggestion that had been made by the RCMP and seized on it as if it were fact, and then shared it as if it was fact. And he said that they had been charged with theft. What was the guy supposed to do? He said. And so these are subtle. They're not going to get anywhere close to meeting the legal threshold for hate speech, and yet it's there. It's beginning. It's the words that are insinuating themselves into the public dialogue and into the public way of thinking about that crime. And so to see that was just, it was frustrating and disturbing, to say the least. At one point, I know that the Star Phoenix very quickly had a reporter out there who went and got the story from the victim group, and immediately we began hearing about, putting a face to Colten Boushie. Who was he? And there was just a consistent message that he was a decent young man and he was a traditional man. And there were examples of him following his tradition, such as being a firekeeper for ceremonies. And for Indigenous people, that speaks very, very loudly, because participating in ceremony is a serious commitment that it's not just superficial. And so it spoke loudly to Indigenous people about who he was. But Christopher Benke, it was actually Dave Lucan who dismissed that positive information, and by bringing up a story about a black kid in the U.S. who had been shot by the police, and it turned out he had robbed someplace. And so the positive information about Colten was, undermined or dismissed. And there again, subtle, and yet it still had that effect of bringing the victim into contempt. Because it's, the suggestion was that just because you're hearing good things about this guy doesn't mean he's actually a good person. There's a good, the suggestion is, of course, he's probably a criminal. And then it was also very disturbing that on that same page, in that thread, was Ben Coates, who was an elected representative in the rural municipality of Browning. And he said that Stanley's only mistake was leaving witnesses. So he later resigned. But even though he resigned, the reeve of the rural municipality he worked for chose not to comment at all, and another councillor on that same rural municipality council said that people just get their dander up. There's so many thefts that people get their dander up, and so he was diminishing the seriousness of the hateful remarks that others were making. So diminishing the seriousness of the mistake, of the remarks, and that sort of diminishing words that are hateful is very, very common, and it's very difficult to combat that, because if we just take one of those examples, like Kane Robertson says, it's time to start retaliating. The cops aren't doing anything about it. Time to start making people scared as hell to come close to farmyards. So that's not going to meet the threshold for hate speech, but it exemplifies the kind of thinking that was out there. All of the people who agreed with him in that thread are clearly, Facebook provides a place where they can all come together and agree on certain kinds of things, and it becomes that echo chamber, as we hear, where people are saying what they know other people will be okay with, right? And those people who might go on that page and see those comments might leave in disgust and not participate. But those who have those feelings, many are bold enough to feel that they can say that with support. I was going to mention as well that it's not confined to Facebook, but Twitter as well. And there was a person whose handle is A Frosty Friday, tweeted at the CBC's current hashtag Stanley trial, another example of hashtag Too Many Indians. Fault is John A. Macdonald's. Should have killed them all when it was a lot easier. So, the RCMP in Saskatchewan received 85 complaints, and many of those complaints were about the same posts. And the RCMP also went through if people were phoning from the city to the RCMP, they referred those complaints to the municipal police, and ultimately they were left with 18 complaints that they investigated. And they were all investigated, analyzed, and assessed, and none of them were found to meet the threshold for charges to be laid. And so there were no charges laid in any of the hate speeches in the Boushie case. However, Corporal Rob King from the RCMP told me this morning that that there were charges laid in a Flin Flon case. And you may be familiar with this. It's from last summer, where a woman, a hairdresser from Flin Flon, her name was Destiny Spiller. And I'm naming names. I'm doing this very deliberately because because I can, and because they deserved, if you know these people, then you should know this about them. So anyway, Destiny posted photos of her car that had been spray painted with graffiti, and her car and her garage door, and it just ruined the paint job. And she said, "Res mutts, please stay on the res." And that, and then she and Racine Chasson got into a conversation on Facebook. And Racine is a 25-year-old woman from Denair Beach here in Saskatchewan. And she identifies herself on her Facebook page as a mentor at Ecole Mizek School and a substitute teacher at Creighton Community School. And she doesn't work there anymore, apparently. Racine said, I think it's time to have a 24-hour purge day. And this is referencing a movie in which, some kind of time in the future or something where people could go out and commit any crime, including murder, for one day with no penalty. And so Destiny responded, "No, it's time to keep the animals locked up or have a shoot an Indian day." So, Destiny, that was the second time that Destiny referred to Indigenous people as subhuman. And that was, of course, what we heard Grant say that Hitler was doing with with the Jews, is dehumanizing them. So that had, Racine Chasson was enthusiastic about that. She said, yeah, girl, purge. Let's grab Budweiser and some shotguns. And Destiny Spiller was down with that. So, and that drew a third woman to join the conversation, and I regret that I cannot tell you the name of that woman because I couldn't find the post again when I went looking for it. But a third woman who I believe was also charged said something along the lines of, I'm going to go and kill an Indian. She actually said she was going to kill an Indian. And so these complaints did go to, someone complained to the police, and there were actually charges laid, but the cases never went to court. They went to mediation. And so mediation is, as Corporal King pointed out, this is for less serious charges. It's where the complainant and the people who are accused are handled in an out-of-court situation, and so often it's things like a letter of apology is written to the complainant. But you know, you have to wonder if a letter of apology was written, how effective that would have been, considering it never got to the press, you know, or the news. And the story itself had been heavily covered by reporters, especially CTV did a lot of stories about it. And it was interesting because the CTV National had it on their national news, and they showed the Facebook posts, and anyone looking at national TV could have seen the names of Destiny Spiller and Racine Chasson. But the local outlet, and there were stories that I saw where this was reported in various local CTV outlets. They edited the screens, and they didn't show all of the information, all of the statements that were made. So, for instance, Racine Chasson's response, "Yeah, girl, purge. Let's grab Budweiser and some shotguns," was edited, and the reporter in town who was doing a stand-up said that post said, "Yeah, girl, purge." So I don't know, you know, it raises questions about, well, why did the reporters not include a very incriminating statement? Like they used other statements, but that was left out. And it's interesting because, alcohol and shotguns was what she was calling for. And to not include that seemed like a protection of the people who'd made these remarks. And so here, and I don't know why it was, and as a journalist, I really don't want to think that it was deliberate, but the effect was definitely to protect the people, I think. And so that was disturbing to me. And especially since it was after the Budweiser and shotguns statement that the third woman was moved to declare that she was going to do it. So it's just interesting. I think that, let's see. I think I sometimes wonder if I should say these things, but I guess I'm just going to say it because the system is set up to protect white privilege. That people are allowed, like there's just, it allows people to say things, or they say things without realizing that they're demonstrating that. Like it may have been an unconscious decision to leave that information out. Likewise, in the Gerald Stanley thing, one of the stories after the verdict recounted what had happened in the farmyard. And it was described as Gerald Stanley's son hit the windshield with a hammer, and the car tried to drive away and smashed into another vehicle in the yard. But in fact, the evidence had shown that the son smashed that windshield with the hammer, and that the vehicle, when they were trying to drive away, they couldn't see through the windshield anymore, and plus the driver was really intoxicated. He collided with another vehicle in the farmyard. So this is so subtle. It's so subtle, right? Like, because hitting a windshield is not as violent as smashing it. And smashing into a vehicle is more violent than colliding with it. And so these things creep in. And so those are just one of the things that Chief Sheila North, she's a Grand Chief of, I think it's, I'm not sure of her exact title, but she's an Indigenous leader in Manitoba. And she pointed out that the statements show that property is more important than the life of a human being, of an Indigenous human being. And that's certainly the way it played out. Let's see. And I know, I think I might be straying away from hate speech, but I've just got to throw this in here. That among those farmers with firearm statements was this one fella who said that, you know, there've been so many thefts of farm equipment, it really gets people's dander up. And so, and the assumption, the implication was that the thieves got to be Indians, right? They got to be Native people. And yet, as a reporter, two big cases jump out at me. One was Kurt Douglas Goosen, who stole around $300,000 worth of vehicles, equipment, recreational vehicles, and building supplies, and had them out on his acreage. And he pleaded guilty to 8 property offenses, and he got 2 years of house arrest, like 2 years less a day sentence to be served in the community, which means he gets to stay at home. And then 2 years of probation on top of that. And he had to pay $31,000 in restitution. And Goosen's father was a retired Saskatoon police officer, and his wife was a nurse. And Kurt Goosen has 2 university degrees, and he was working as an apprentice electrician. And I wondered if Ben Kotz would declare that killing Kurt Goosen would be okay as long as there were no witnesses. And then there was also, let's not forget, Ian Stables, who stole $1.2 million worth of farm equipment over 5 years. And he lived south of Hanley, but a little bit west. And the area that he stole from included the bigger area. So, in my own thinking, I'm wondering how many of the angry farmers who'd had their equipment stolen and were angry at the Indigenous people on the reserves around there had actually had their stuff stolen by Ian Stables. Ian Stables was a well-respected rancher who'd had he was the subject of a big Country Canada magazine article, a wonderful spread, and talking about how his family came from Scotland, and he was, doing all this stuff. And so it was just interesting that he doesn't fit anybody's stereotype, right? Let's see. Let's see. So, I think, now, and I just wanted to talk a little bit as well about, and this is not, again, the hard hate speech stuff, but I'm just gonna mention it, how subtle language can also be harmful. And there was an Anglican minister, Mark Kleiner, who said that Colten Boushie is the Rodney King of Canada. And I thought that was interesting because, of course, the thing about the Rodney King case, and many of you here are younger, so you might not remember all the way back to the early 1990s. Rodney King was a black man who was, he was beaten by 4 Los Angeles Police Department cops. And it was caught on video, and this was early days. Someone actually had a camcorder. They didn't have an iPhone, they had a camcorder, and they caught this on camera. And it was stunning to people because these things, this was, an early case of this so-called citizen journalism. And, it led, the 4 police officers were acquitted, even though they saw the footage of the police they took him to the ground and beat him 57 strikes with batons. And there were 4 officers doing it. And they were all found not guilty of using excessive force. And that very day, the riots began. There were 6 days of riots. In that time, 63 people died. There was over $1 billion in property damage. And, people were angry. And I thought, that is not a good example to say that Colten Boushie was the Rodney King of Canada is not right. And so let me say that I would prefer if the Reverend had compared Colten Boushie to, his name was, oh my goodness, where am I? Don't tell me I've lost the name. His name, I can't believe I haven't got it here. I do have it. Emmett Till. Emmett Till. In 1955, Emmett Till was a black 14-year-old in Mississippi. He was from Chicago. He was visiting Mississippi. He made a flirtatious remark to a white woman in a restaurant, and he was pulled out of his bed that night, or maybe it was a few days later, by the woman's husband and his friend. And he was murdered, found in the river a couple days later. And that led, that was the killing was early in the year. The trial was that summer. The 2 men were acquitted. They were found not guilty. And by December of that year, the Montgomery bus boycott began. And so Emmett Till is a person of color who was murdered and whose death sparked a response. And the response of the Indigenous community was more like the response of the black community to the death of Emmett Till. It began the human rights, the civil rights movement of in the United States. And in Canada, we did not see any riots by Indigenous people after Stanley was acquitted. There were no, I mean, I don't think I even saw any hateful remarks from Indigenous people on Facebook. What I saw were people sitting in sharing circles and mourning. And we saw here in Saskatoon, I'm happy to say that there were many people, including many non-Indigenous allies, who came out to a rally in front of the courthouse down on Spadina Crescent, the Queen's Bench Courthouse, on the Saturday after the verdict to just come together and denounce the verdict. So it mattered that those people were there. It mattered that people spoke against the verdict. And so, I mean, I'm sorry, I know I've kind of gone off a little bit far afield from hate speech per se, but as I say, I believe that it's really a continuum. And for Indigenous people, the hate speech that was on Facebook, to me, it was devastating because we were all, like, it was, first of all, it was devastating when Colton was murdered or killed. It was devastating when when Stanley was found not guilty. But the comments had their own kind of injury that they brought, and it felt like a violation of the implicit promise that we have of being Canadians. Isn't Canada proud to be a decent country filled with decent people, and they're so polite and kind and considerate and such a multicultural country? And as people of color, we know that that's not true all the time. We know that. Our experience shows it. But we want to believe in it. And to see people committing to Facebook right there with their names and their pictures, being willing to say those things, it was heartbreaking. And part of the hardest thing about it is, I mean, as much as it hurts for me, I still feel a response in my arms, like a physiological response, is the discussions that we had to have with our young people. I have a nephew who is 11, and to have to say to him that you are a brown boy and you will be treated differently. And you have to be the better person. You have to, you can speak back, but you can't fight back. Because we know, I mean, look at Maclean's Magazine did a thing about the difference between the way Indigenous university students were treated compared to white university students. When they encountered the police, they were more likely to be stopped by the police. They were more likely, of all the people who were arrested, they were more likely to be charged. Of all those who were charged, they were more likely to be convicted. Of all those convicted, they were more likely to be the ones who spent time in jail. Among all those people in jail, Indigenous people are more likely to serve more of their sentence, less likely to get early parole, more likely to be in solitary confinement. And so, yeah, it hurts when you have to tell an 11-year-old boy who's just coming into puberty that, we know that this is the moment when people start looking at him as a brown man, as an Indigenous man. And they've got to live with that. And how do you talk to a child about that? So I guess I think I've taken up my 15 minutes, and I hope that wasn't too far afield from the hate speech topic.
Thank you very much. Yeah, all of you panelists, and also David, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm going to try to sort of move through my talk at breakneck speed. So I guess, and that might be easy, because in terms of actual psychological research on hate speech, it's a bit sparse. So like Betty Ann, I've been thinking about it more in terms of a continuum. and sort of expanding from there. So I guess just to say basically hate speech, harmful speech, abusive speech can be inspired by any aspect of differentness from others. So a minority, we've been mainly talking about visible minorities tonight. Any minority outgroup can be targeted by the in-group, and you'll see this often online and in person. So the folks that I have worked with or encountered have told me about times when they've been subject to harmful speech, whether that's hate speech or verbal abuse, because of ethnicity, because of gender, because of sexual orientation, because of their weight, because of physical or cognitive abilities, because of mental illness, and sometimes just totally random, kind of just for whatever reason got targeted as somehow being different and ended up carrying on that label. And I guess just to say that of course, that verbal abuse continues on in the intimacy of our homes as well. So I have been seeing it as quite broad tonight. As we've heard tonight, of course, words can hurt us. And the mechanism of that psychological impact isn't fully understood, but at a very basic level, like we heard tonight, is that violation of your sense of safety and your violation of a sense of connectedness, being part of that Canadian fabric in this instance. And without that sense of safety and connectedness, aspects of our psychological development just simply do not happen the same way. Parts of our brain do not wire the same way. So it can have that impact on us in terms of how we respond to future events quite differently, depending on whether we first encounter some of those events later on in life and we've had a relatively, I guess you'd say, enriched and safe environment in which we've grown up, or whether we've actually been the victim of repeated experiences of abuse or of hatred or of trauma. So the psychological impacts of hate speech then can be as varied as any of the mental health or addictions issues that you would choose to name. So for example, reduced self-confidence or self-esteem, an internalization, a hatred of self or a belief that it's true. And there's a beautiful song by Buffy Sainte-Marie and Tanya Tagaq. And she says, whether you're a woman or whether you're a man, sometimes you got to take a stand. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, or I am, about that sort of social justice piece that can come out of this. But in her first verse, she says, down in a hole, you feel like two different people in your soul, feel like a loser until you see that as you bend, you learn to be your own best friend. And I think that really speaks to how that sort of continuous, repetitive verbal abuse, or I would say hate speech, racial discrimination can have on a person. You can find that yourself having reduced motivation to try because it's hopeless, or the other side, a desire to be perfect. You know, like you were talking about your nephew, you know, you can't fight back. So you've got to somehow be the perfect example so everybody could know that, well, I can be whatever other we fit in and we can be successful. So it can go both ways. Certainly feeling sense of depression, oftentimes a sense of anxiety and hypervigilance, an avoidance of situations or places. That happens, I think, frequently for folks who have experienced this. And then also sometimes turning to addictions just to kind of numb the emotions that can go with that experience. And then also many of the folks that I work with who are, I guess, are involved in trying to lobby to make things better or different also tell me about the fatigue from the fight, just being tired of having to defend yet again why they should have the same rights, the same privileges, the same sense of safety, the same freedom. I guess in terms of the impacts of hate speech on the bystander, the research is still very new, but obviously one of the things we've talked about tonight is that the bystander also comes to believe that the other is less than human, or it dehumanizes the other. And it also, one of the newer studies suggests that we have a reduced sensitivity to hate speech and an increased prejudice. So simply by being around it and absorbing it, our attitudes start to change. And I would say then potentially a reduced action on our part in terms of social justice. So just in closing, I thought a little bit about how do we repair ourselves as individuals and communities, helpers and allies. I guess for myself, what I've thought about over the years is that oftentimes I observe individuals who have very close bonds with other people who are non-judgmental and with whom we feel a great sense of safety, so that we can have the courage to come to something like this tonight and speak openly about our thoughts and our experiences. Seeking communities that support us and heal us. So examples like sports communities, art, music, volunteer communities. There's a very beautiful poem that I just read in my faith community last week called How Did the Rose by Hafiz, 1300 Persian poet. And he writes, how did the rose ever open its heart and give to this world all its beauty? It felt the encouragement of light against its being. Otherwise, we all remain too frightened. And lastly, I guess I would encourage each of us to think about how we might push back against hate speech. My daughter is a great fan of Hozier's music, and he just came out with a new album. Have you been listening to that? Wasteland. And in his song, Nina Cried Power, he writes, it's not the song, it's the singin'. It's the heaven of the human spirit ringin'. It is the bringin' of the line, it's the bearin' of the lie. It's not the wakin', it's the risin'. Very similar, I think, to Buffy Sainte-Marie and Tanya Tagax too, hey? So I just encourage each of you to seek what you could do to push back. I know that I personally have a sense of inadequacy when I read the headlines, when I see what's in society. I'm just not sure where to start or what to do. And I guess I'd encourage each of you to think about what's one small thing you could do. What's one larger thing you could start? For myself, in the place where I work, I was able to have some good folks from the City Hospital Foundation contribute towards a painting by Kevin Pies, and it's now a very large mural on one of our walls. And he came in and did a collaborative artwork project with our patients and our families and our staff. And I think it not only sends a message of hope for recovery. I mean, those of you who know Kevin's work know how beautiful and vibrant it is, but he also specifically painted all the different patients to have different colors of skin as a message of inclusion. And I guess we hope that even just having that on the wall sends a message of inclusion and of an embracing of diversity. And so that's just a very small thing, scheme of things, but it was something that I could do. And so I guess I just encourage each of you to think about how you might be able to push back in some small or large way. Thank you.
It's a privilege to be able to ask questions of this panel that's shared so much and given so much to us tonight, so thank you so much. I have a two-part, very simple question that builds on the last speaker. Woman or man, sometimes we all have to take a stand. That's been a theme for tonight, and I was just hoping we could hear a little bit more, maybe some examples where our panelists have seen people take a stand, because I think we're all looking for ways to do that, whether it's when we see hate on social media or we're in those conversations where someone starts off with, I don't mean to sound racist, but, and I know it's not politically correct, but, and then goes on to say something that's clearly showing some racist or hateful views. I'm hoping the panelists can give us some examples where they've seen people take a stand and inspire us. And then also, in taking a stand, something I saw through the Stanley verdict feedback was that when you take a stand, you become a target. So if there are thoughts about, there were some beautiful thoughts in the last presenter about how we can form community, but interested to hear maybe some other thoughts about how we can handle becoming targets when we do take a stand. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind for me is when something does happen, a racist event happens. Oftentimes, it's the support of the community that comes out to help you that makes a huge difference. One example that I can think of, a personal example, is that our synagogue was firebombed here in 1999, 2000, and the outpouring of support that the Jewish community got because of that made a huge difference. I think if you're a victim of that, you certainly think the whole world's against you. And when you see people taking the time to come out, to say things, to attend events, to attend a vigil, whatever the case may be, I think that's very healing, and I think that that's a huge step towards saying to other people, no, we don't accept this, it's not acceptable, and we don't agree with it.
Guess we'll each weigh in. I'll do another shameless plug here. NCCM, we do have a bystander training program that we've developed called the Say Salam Project to help people overcome their fear of intervening when they see or hear racist and Islamophobic messaging. So we're certainly happy to provide that kind of training as well. Just a personal example, and this goes to an expression that I read recently that said, don't let that which you can't do stop you from doing that which you can. So I was recently in Toronto at the time of the Pittsburgh shootings, and one of my friends in the Jewish community, Bernie Farber, who's the former head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, lives in the northern part of Toronto, and I was there for other business, but I saw this in the news, and I made a point that's, it sort of thought about it, and I thought, you know, what can I do? And I didn't know what to do, so I just went to his house with some flowers and just showed up, and I saw the TV crew was there, and he was obviously doing an interview, so I waited quietly until the interview was over, and he just looked at me and said, you know, did you come here just for this? And I said, well, you know, if I could come here just for this, I would have, but I was in town anyway, and I thought, what better way to spend my time than coming just to see you and to show solidarity with you and your community and to let you know that, you know, I know how much this hurts and we've been there and we're here for you.
That's awesome. I think I'm kind of blanking on a real good example, but I know that certainly just in everyday life, I know that whenever the subject of race comes up, there are always people who express goodwill, and that in and of itself means a lot. Every time I see a letter to the editor that calls for civility and praises people who do the right thing, it helps, because every negative message can be balanced to some degree with positive messages, and so just like, you know, you try to every day, you know, give a certain number of really positive remarks to your kid just to offset whatever kind of nastiness the world might have shown them. I think it just matters, and I think it's something we can all do easily, is just to express support, and in those moments when someone's said something hurtful, just to stand with the victim, just to stand beside them and speak up for them and with them, because it really makes a difference.
I'm sorry, I don't have a lot to add to that. Yeah, I just think it's, I mean, again, I do think it's just so important to create places of safety to which we can retreat, so that we can have a place that encourages us and supports us and then moves us forward, because I do think it takes some energy to take that stand. And I really believe that starts in our own homes. And I guess that sounds very simplistic, but you know, I have 3 children, and when they were all school age, I mean, you know what school can be like. They're not always good citizens, David, despite your wonderful program. And got through to all the kids at River Heights and Marion Graham anyways. And I used to say to the kids when they came home, this is a place of safety. Like, I don't mind if you tease, I don't mind if you joke, like whatever, that's all great. But we need one place, at least in our lives, where we can have a sense of safety and security, so that we can go back out again and do the things we do. Yeah.
I also want to acknowledge all of the speakers. This was incredibly informative, incredibly captivating, and I learned quite a few concepts, I think, that I hadn't really heard before presented in the same way. So I do want to ask a question based on one of those. Thank you for coming here to the U of S. Of course, this is an environment where the concept of academic freedom is spoken about often and used often. Tonight I learned, like I said earlier, a couple of different ideas or different phrases. And Ms. Adam, you had said them. You had said, you know, there's this idea of subtle hate speech and an idea of hard hate speech. And that's sitting in my mind right now, working in this environment all the time. I also thought a fair bit about the responsibility of media for accountability in reporting, also the knowledge that hate speech leads to hate crime. And so my question to each of you is, from your perspectives, is one of those two, subtle hate speech, hard hate speech, more cumulatively or impactfully harmful than the other, and how? And then from that, might your responses lead us to a better understanding of new places where we might start to address this challenge?
Well, I think the entire concept of hate speech, you know, some of it is a continuum. Some of it's very subtle and certainly wouldn't reach the legal limit of what one would consider hate speech. But that may even be more harmful than the obvious hate speech, because it's quite prevalent. You see it all the time in the way things are reported, way things are said, way people talk, jokes that are told. Those are somewhat subtle, but they send a message. And I think that it's not as obvious, but it's maybe just as important and just as impactful and hurts just as much. So I think that it's you have to be vigilant about that. I know that, you know, jokes are often told that are, you know, racist jokes or sexist jokes. You know, in our office, we talk about the fact that that's not acceptable anymore. You know, it's not the old boys club, and it shouldn't be. And you have to take those stands and take those steps, because, yeah, it's not hate speech to tell a racist joke, perhaps, but it's starting it. And it's because it's so subtle, it may have as much or more of an impact on somebody just coming out and say, I hate so-and-so.
What do you add to that? I think I would agree with what Grant has said in terms of the challenge of dealing with subtle versus hard, if you want to define it as such, hate speech, is often more challenging. And when we talk about hate crimes, we often say that hate crimes are message crimes, in that they're not only to target a particular individual, but to send a message to that individual and to that community that they are other, that they don't belong, that they're not welcome, and that they should be fearful. And in the same way, hate speech can have that same ripple effect. It'll impact the person who hears it, but it also impacts their relations with the broader society, with their community. And so it's something I think we need to be vigilant about, and to speak out when we see it. As Grant said, to reevaluate, what is the standard to which we hold ourselves.
It's funny because for so much of my life, it was the subtle words that I heard. It was those subtle remarks that I heard, the undercurrent. And I learned very young that there was no point in bringing it up because I was told I was being oversensitive. I was told that I was imagining things. I was essentially, my experience, my perception wasn't valid. And so, as you mature and grow up, you know that, in fact, like even if I was getting these, when you're younger, you're like, okay. But then when you get older, okay, yes, in fact, it's a thing. That's a thing. You can't call people out on these hateful things they're implying or saying or joking about. But what's been really stunning is, is the degree of the slide into uncivility in society. And I keep thinking that it's all started with Donald Trump, but it couldn't have started there. But when you have the president of the most powerful nation in the world, calling all a whole group of countries, shithole nations, like that, how much worse can it get than to have the leader of the free world saying things like that? And that just opened up the door for people who've had those thoughts and who've been saying things subtly to say them more blatantly. And I can't help thinking that the whole Donald Trump phenomena had something to do with what happened that day on Gerald Stanley's farm. And if not on that very act, then certainly on the responses that we saw. And so, I think that there's been, I don't know, maybe it's because we let the subtle racism, the subtle slurs, the subtle comments, because those have been tamped down, and because those of us who heard it felt like, okay, I can't rock the boat because I'm making people feel uncomfortable if I call them out. I think we all of us have a role as the person who is biting their tongue to speak out, to say it, even if it means feeling uncomfortable. But also as leaders in the community, as the owners of businesses or the managers or the deans or the professors or whatever roles of leadership you might have, you have to be open to being called out on stuff and to let others call out others in your presence. And to, if it feels uncomfortable, just give it a minute and let it play out. Like let people express themselves. Because a lot of, it's called tone policing, right? So if you get too excited about something, like the teacher or the instructor or the manager or the business owner feels like they got to, like, calm down, it's not that bad. And even if you weren't even excited, but just the fact that you named it, right? So there's a role for everybody, like whether you're the person who doesn't want to bite your tongue and now you're going to say it, or whether you're the person who's asking others to tone it down. And I, you know, to say tone it down is even, there's a bit of language, right? Because to say tone it down suggests that the person was being screechy, you know, and strident about it, when maybe all they were just doing was pointing out some uncomfortable facts in a matter-of-fact ways. But to say tone it down suggests that there was something about their tone of voice that made it inappropriate. So that's my thoughts on that.
I don't have a research answer for that, obviously. I'm a little, you know, psychologists are sort of scientist practitioners, right? And I was doing all this research and there's no research, so I feel a little bit like, oh, I have nothing to sort of hide behind almost tonight. So I'll give you another opinion on that. And that is that I think that the experience that you were talking about in terms of, I mean, I really don't know which is worse. I mean, it's almost impossible to say which is worse. But I do think that experience of the dog whistle, of, you know, if you're part of the out group, you can hear it. If you're part of the in group, you don't even realize it's happening. And then if you're part of the in group, you deny the out group's experience. You know, you say, well, no, that didn't really happen. That wasn't. And I think, especially at younger ages, when we're more impressionable and people are saying to us, oh, no, it wasn't really like that. You didn't really experience that. Then it's kind of like, oh, I feel like I experienced that, but I guess I must not have experienced that. And then that starts to kind of mess with our heads a bit. And we start to sort of question ourselves in many ways. And so I think that can affect us and our development. If we're lucky enough, we have some mentors along the way who say, no, you did experience that, and you need to, you know, hold true to that and to stand up with that. But I think there can be some sort of subtle experiences of that. And I think the worst cases that I see of that are when it's a child or a spouse in an abusive relationship that's gone on for years, and they really start to feel like they completely deny so many pieces of their experience. And then when they start to try to take that back, it's like we're doing a complete rebuild. So I mean, I know that world a little bit more, but I have also seen that for clients that I've worked with who have, like I said, experienced being part of the out group. And it's tough to claim back the experience and to know what you stand for. It does affect our development pretty profoundly.
With the consent of the panel, I'm going to extend this a little bit to make sure we can have some questions if people might want to ask some questions. So I'm going to ask those that have some questions to come forward. And David Catesman, you're going to be the second person to bring that information that you've showed me. I think it's pertinent tonight. But Chris Seacott is over there. Please identify yourself, Chris, for the record, and you're consenting to being videotaped.
Sure. Is this microphone on? Yeah, well, thank you, Judge Arnott. Yeah, Chris Seacott, as he just identified. Yes, I do consent to being filmed. Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments this evening. I know Mr. Cates may want to bring this up, but I'm going to bring it up right now as well. The panelists may not be aware of this, but about 90 minutes ago, there's been a reporting of 2 shootings in mosques in New Zealand, multiple casualties. This happened just before Juma prayers in New Zealand, so we have, this is a developing story that's just broken in the last hour or so. So you're probably not aware that this has happened right now, but it just seems highly ironic when we're standing here talking about hate speech that this event is just happening half a world away right now. Further to that, and maybe not so much more of a question, but maybe more of a comment, Judge Arnott, one of the panelists had talked about what we can do as individuals to try and help with hate speech. And my wife reminded me of what happened when we had the incident that happened here in Quebec City in January. And a number of different hats that I wear, but one that I'm very proud of that I wear is I'm the chair of the City of Saskatoon's now Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee. And that's a role that I take very seriously, and it's a role that we as a committee work at, working to make Saskatoon a more diverse city, but we also work on anti-racism. And part of that role that I've undertaken is working with different community groups. Specifically, I've been reaching out to the Muslim community over the last little while as an Indigenous man who had really very limited exposure to the Muslim community up until a few years ago. It was something that I felt was important because at this particular junction in 2015, 2016 was when we were seeing the beginning of the ramping up of rhetoric, especially against Indigenous people and Muslims at the time of the federal election. So I felt that there was a lot of similarities there, but then the mosque shooting occurred. And I developed a very close friendship with a number of people within the mosque, specifically the former president of the mosque, Omar Jamil, and I have become very close friends. And he had contacted me right after that had happened and asked, we're putting together an event, is there anything that you can do to try to help us to have the Indigenous community involved? So immediately I got on the phone and talked with a couple of individuals. I got a hold of FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron. I got a hold of a couple of elders, one from the First Nations community, one from the Métis community, and without hesitation, they said, yes, we'll be there to support the Muslim community. So yes, what you're saying, it takes a bit of courage. It takes having the ability to look within yourself and push yourself beyond your own boundaries, but you have to understand what your limitations are and hopefully push beyond that. And I think that being able to do that, especially within communities that have been so marginalized, takes a lot of effort, but it's well worth it in the end. And working with organizations, even within the Jewish community, and I look at my good friend over here, Chief Cooper, who's been such a powerful ally as well in trying to bridge those community gaps as well, making sure that we're all working together. So my question to you is, not really so much of a question, but we do have allies. We are working together. We'll continue to work together, and I thank you so much for taking the time this evening. Hi.
Any response?
I wasn't aware of the shooting. Thank you for letting me know. I'm imagining as soon as I pick up my phone, which I have diligently not touched in my pocket, there will be a lot of messages on there, and it means that as opposed to going to bed tonight, as I'd hoped to, I'll probably be up quite late, sort of looking at our response as a community, and your words of encouragement and support are very, very welcome, and I can say that it is so incredibly important. One thing that sort of struck me when I can't remember who was saying it, but I read a quote that kind of reminded me of what one of the comments was, and it said recently, we can measure our own progress in terms of the number of uncomfortable conversations that we're willing to have. And it sort of reminded me of that quote when I heard somebody sort of using similar language, and I thought to myself, how do you get beyond that discomfort? It's like stage fright. People ask me, you speak publicly all the time, and you do media interviews all the time, do you get nervous? And I always tell them I still get nervous. I still have to prep, and I still have to think about what are my messages, what are my key points that I make. I still stress about it. You can ask my host here, Fatima. I was telling her, calling her saying, what is the expectation? And you never get over that if your heart is in the right place and your sincerity is in the right place to try and deliver the correct message in a way that is, reflective of your values. So that's something that you have to continue to work at, and it takes just a willingness to do that.
Thank you. David, did you want to bring everybody up to speed on what you just showed me?
Well, my name's David Catesman. I'm the president of the Saskatoon B'nai B'rith. I'm also pleased to say I'm an employee of the Human Rights Commission, and I believe the previous spokesperson told you the pertinent details of this horrific shooting, which was apparently videotaped by the shooter. So it's too soon to say a lot definitively, but it is horrific. And on behalf of the B'nai B'rith of Saskatoon, I want to express our sincere condolences and our unequivocal support for the Muslim community. I did have one question. I very much dislike the term alt-right. It appears to be a sanitized version of far-right. The far right doesn't want to be called the far right. They don't want to be called the extreme right. They want to look hip. They want to be called the alt-right. Do you have any feelings about that term, and should we be reacting and refusing to use that term?
Yeah, I have a reaction to that term. I mean, it's simply a term that they're trying to use to indicate that they're an alternative, a legitimate alternative to other people who may be on the right, when in fact they are, by and large, racists, and many white supremacists in that organization that subscribe to that. I think they are doing exactly that. They're trying to sanitize who they are and what they are for the purpose of legitimizing themselves. It's not unheard of in society to do that, but I certainly wouldn't use that term to describe them ever, because I think it does somewhat legitimize them, or people think they're legitimate when they hear that term as opposed to what they actually are.
I'll just add to that. I'm not a big fan of the term either, and I share the concern around using it and the legitimacy that it gives to people who espouse those views. And what I would refer you to, and just as a resource if people are interested, there's an excellent book by, I think he's a clinical psychologist in the States named George Lakoff. And he wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate. And so what he talks about is, the idea that, words and the language we use are so critical, and that they behave like muscles. So the more you use them, the stronger they get. And when you start using the words of your opposition in trying to make an argument, if the people who are sympathetic to the argument of your opposition hear you using those words, regardless of how much logic you bring to the table and your facts and your arguments and your figures, they don't hear that. All they hear is the language being repeated and you almost endorsing that frame of reference. So I think it's a very valuable lesson for us to look at in terms of not ceding that ground, the very first battleground, which is the battleground of language and words.
All right, there's a fellow over here on this microphone. I think we're going to have, I would say, maybe 2 or 3 more questions, because I see people are, we're running a little late here. So go ahead, sir.
Okay. I'm wondering if history will provide us with another occasion like 80 years ago, when something much bigger was coming, the Nazi threat, which operated supposedly under the radar for over a decade. And a threat of that magnitude forces the politically correct left and whatever the racist rednecks or whatever you want to call them that we're in pitched battle with today. I wonder if there's something on the horizon that will provide us with an occasion to imitate that spirit of World War II, where the Western democracies had to come together and not set aside their differences, but just work together to survive. Elsewhere in the world today, there's things going on that seem on a magnitude that defies imagination. A country of over 1 billion people shows how hate speech can operate without any identifying characteristics to distinguish between identical citizens. Yet the hate speech manages to work, and the demonization works. And if the documentation proves to be absolutely correct, there's tens of millions of people, a population the size of Canada, inside a country of over 1 billion, that through the pure exercise of power through hate speech are being arbitrarily arrested, incarcerated, kept in secret incarceration, employed as slave laborers in prison factories, and other horrible things done to them that I don't know if I can even believe. But this is going on today. It's been going on for nearly a couple decades. Our Western democracies have been, if not complicit, they're so economically aligned with that power that they dare not challenge it, dare not step out of line, because a little pipsqueak country like Canada could easily get squashed. We're seeing it in a very minor scenario with the cancellation of grain contracts with a country. It's just a warning shot. And I wonder, at what point did the Western democracies realize that to survive in a form that we find acceptable, that we have to not set aside our differences, which are great and are clashing and are offensive inside our prosperous gated community here. They seem monumental, our differences, but they're really not. Compared to this other situation, we have to become aware at some point that they are huge things on the horizon that we're going to have to deal with, I believe.
Thanks.
Well, I'm not sure I have good news on that front as far as properly reacting to these atrocities that occur. I think if one thing history has taught us is that we've never learned from history. And I think that, unless it's at your doorstep, it's somewhere else and you don't care. You look after your own self-interests. And I think that, Western countries have not done well, Western democracies have not done well in stepping up and saying and doing the right thing at all through a series of these atrocities, whether it's Rwanda, even in the Holocaust. At the end of the day, the Minister of Immigration in Canada during the Holocaust was asked the question, how many Jews are you going to allow into Canada while they're being slaughtered in Europe? And his answer was, the title of a book that came out, "None is too many." That was our response, how we treated Japanese interns, and the United States did the same during the war. So we don't have a good track record of doing the right thing, in my view. And unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to change in the near future.
I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you, Grant.
Okay. Okay, there's a gentleman over here. Just identify yourself, please, sir, and then ask your question. And then
Yes.
Sherry Van Hesterden, are you, okay? You're going to have the last question, Sherry, because I have to wrap this up tonight. So, sir, identify yourself and ask your
Yes.
question, please.
My
Thank you.
name is Cameron. I'll try and keep this quick. I had to adjust my question a little bit. My friend actually left in disappointment earlier. He and I came to this because we were both concerned by the idea of the lowering of the burden for charges for hate speech. And the reason is that he and I became friends over atheism and anti-theism. He himself is an ex-Muslim. Myself, I'm a lifetime non-believer and skeptic. Because the engine behind changing the laws around hate speech are so much driven by the internet, social media platforms and such, we've been very concerned lately. Both of us have been accused of hate speech while saying nothing against any particular people, merely being critical of ideologies. So my question on his and my behalf both is, for all of you really, do any of you foresee a mechanism by which he and I can be assured that we're not next? As people are already accusing us online of being hate speakers, then how can we be assured that as the burden comes down, that he and I aren't going to face indictments simply for being opposed to religions?
Well, that begs the entire issue in question of course, the freedom of expression versus how far can you go and can't you go. I think the burden of prosecution for hate speech in Canada, certainly from the criminal perspective, is very, very high. And one would hope that you... so far. And I don't think there's any talk, at least not that I'm aware of lowering that standard from the criminal code perspective. The Supreme Court, as I said before, has set a very high threshold of what would qualify as hate speech in the non-criminal perspective.
But hasn't the theme tonight been about lowering the threshold? You yourself said it. Hasn't that been the whole theme tonight, about lowering the threshold? I know you yourself said it in your words.
Absolutely. I mean, from a personal perspective, I'm not saying lower the threshold of what's there now, because my view is that freedom of expression is important. You have to be able to say it. And I've said, just because it may be hurtful or offensive doesn't mean it's a criminal or an offense. But from a personal perspective, one would hope that that whole rhetoric, that whole level would be toned down to a degree where it would be more civil. That's a far cry from making it a crime or offensive under the acts. So one would hope that unless it reaches that level, you're not going to be persecuted or prosecuted for it. But at the same time, the whole concept of more civility in speech is something that I think everyone should try to strive for.
Anything else to add? No? Okay. Okay, thank you, sir. And Sherry Van Hesterton from Saskatoon Public Schools. Last question.
Hi, I just wanted to tag in on the analogy of the dog whistle that you used, which connects to Betty Ann's identifying of whiteness and dominance as something that hate speech can often defend, and other forms of dominance too. And you used you stated if you're in the in group, you can't even hear it. And among the educators I work with now, we're being led by people like Dr. Verna St. Dennis as members of a dominant group, particularly in education, to hear the dog whistle. And to be able to combine cultural responsiveness, where we learn about, for example, Indigenous peoples, to looking in the mirror and examining and countering the discourses and systemic practices that confer unearned advantage upon ourselves. And I think in this city, with the We Are the Bridges campaign, we saw a certain reluctance in the society of this city to talk about privilege. And I'm just wondering, in the communities that you work with, if you're noticing an increased willingness of people to talk about forms of dominance and the ethical responsibility to dismantle those constructs, both mental and systemic, that so reliably marginalize and produce suffering in particular groups.
It made me think of, I saw a Facebook event just coming up. The Saskatoon Unitarians are having a breakfast potluck on I think it's the 23rd of March, to discuss a book on white fragility. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing, and somebody posted a video by the person who'd written the book, and that was very interesting. She talks about, about the subject of white fragility, and I was very interested that the Unitarians are doing that, so that clearly there's an interest in that community to discuss the topics. But the questions around that they're still very difficult in a one-to-one situation. If you spend your whole life never saying anything about it, then you get along just fine. But when you do tell someone in a one-on-one situation that, give them some examples of things they've done that were hurtful or that were racist, you lose friends. And after it's happened a couple times, I know for myself, I think twice about which people I'm going to say it to, So I think there's movement, and the fact that we're talking about it is a little progress. So that's my thoughts.
Just to add very briefly to that, in terms of the Muslim communities in which I've connected with, and obviously it's a big population, as I mentioned, so I can't say this is a polling sample, but I have noted that there does seem to be a growing willingness to talk about it. It's not growing nearly as fast as I would like and as I think is needed, to talk about privilege and to also recognize that the construct of privilege and dominance is not you either have it or you don't. There can be contexts in which you experience privilege and other contexts in which you experience disadvantage. And there's a growing awareness of that as well. And, for example, with myself, walking down the street, you could mistake me for any one of a number of things. I've been called Greek, Italian, Syrian, Lebanese, Iraqi, Jewish, you name it. And it also depends, I guess, on the time of year, because in the summer I tend to tan very quickly, and as my wife likes to joke, she's married to 50 shades of husband. So right now I'm winter husband, so in different contexts it can mean different things. And visibly, if I'm not dressed traditionally, I don't have a kufi or a traditional hat on, or wearing traditional clothes, I can pass for anything, but others will experience it very differently. So when you're talking about visibly Muslim women, they will experience racism and discrimination more directly, because they can't hide, where they are or where they're coming from and what they believe, because it's very, very visible. So when we're talking about acts of discrimination and harassment targeting the Muslim community, I can tell you that the predominant number of cases that we receive are Muslim women.
Okay, well, I want to first thank you all for coming today and for listening and your questions and observations. This is a serious issue, and there's serious ways that we can respond to it, and some of those ways have been put forward here today by the panel. So thank you very much for coming, each and every one of you. Please keep an eye on this issue. Follow us on Facebook or on our website as we advance the cause of trying to promote and protect human rights by ensuring that hate speech is diminished and certainly regulated in this country. Thank you to the University of Saskatchewan, Michelle Pertula, the Dean of Education, for allowing us to come into this wonderful space. And thank you, Heather Persson, for being one of the responders and asking some challenging questions, making some challenging observations. Thank you, responders. To the panel, I say, wow, what a dynamic group. It was a really interesting discussion, really dynamic and fruitful. So thanks for taking the time to come and help us work through these issues. Grant Sharfstein, QC, Izan Gardi from the National Council of Canadian Muslims, Betty Ann Adam, and Fern Stockdale Winder. Thank you very much, everyone. Safe travels.